Hi guys, welcome to CAT Study 53, module number 26. In this module, we're going to continue the discussion of the terms of sale that we studied in the last module. But this time, we're going to focus on different dating terms. This is the same slide we already saw in last module. In last module, I said there are three different types of terms, which we call 3Ds. And in last module, we took a look at the first D, which is discounts, right? In this module, we're going to focus on the dating terms. Dating terms basically determine the due dates for the invoice to be paid. That means the absolute net amount due. In last module, when we talked about cash discounts, we saw an example of this kind of dating term. That particular term that we saw was what we call regular dating term. But there are more than just the regular dating terms that determines the number of days for cash discount and when the absolute net payment due is. Specifically, we are going to learn 6 different types of dating terms, starting from COD and the regular or ordinary dating term, which we already kind of took a look at when we discussed cash discount in last module. And then there are also extra dating term and EOM and rogue dating term, as well as the post or advanced dating term. We will take a look at each of these terms one by one and more specific. Before we move on to the specific types of dating terms, I would like to make sure that we all understand how many days exist in each month, because this is going to be a critical piece of information that we have to remember for us to be able to decide on the right last day for cash discount and the exact day for the net payment due, because we don't want to miss a day because we miscalculate the number of days. So as we all know, in a year there are 12 months, but each month has different number of days, right? So there are some months that have 30 days, and obviously we already know that the February has only 28 days, except that some of the years, the February may have 29 days. And there are other months that have 31 days. Do you guys remember which month have 30 days and 31 days? If you, I don't know if you guys remember or have learned kind of how to use your fist to determine the number of days in each month, kind of like you kind of make a fist, and then you look at your knuckles, and the part of the knuckles that is out, the protuberant, that indicates the 31 days, and the concave part indicates the 30 days, or less than 31 days. And you start from February, start from the first protuberant part of the knuckle. Okay, that's January, 31 days, and move on to the concave part of the knuckle right next to the first protuberant part. That is the February, so it's less than 31. So February special month, 28 days, and March goes up again, so that's 31. April goes down again, 30. May goes up again, 31. June goes down again, 30. July goes up again, 31. And from then on, you turn around, so the same August protuberant part again, so 31. And September 30, October 31, November 30, December 31. Right? So I don't know if you're familiar with this kind of method. In case you forget, which month had how many days, try to remember how to use the knuckle, and that may help. So in summary, April, June, September, November have 30 days. February has 28 days, and the rest of the month have 31 days. So in this class, we're going to use the actual number of days that exist in each month to calculate when is the last cash discount day and when is the net payment due. The textbook, on the other hand, the the textbook, the required textbook that is written by Tepper. The textbook uses 30 days as a kind of default number of days for each month, every month, for all 12 months. So the answer key in the textbook for the practice problems and on the textbook that are corresponding to this dating terms are actually inaccurate. Okay, in the industry, the two practices, whether you use the actual number of days for each month or kind of assume that every month has 30 days. These both methods actually are used, so you kind of have to be clear on when you try to write a contract and determine the cash discount terms and dating terms and things like that. You have to make clear which way is used. But using the actual number of days in each month is a little bit harder because you also have to remember that the different number of days that each month has. So we're going to go with that method, and if you become very familiar with that method and then you'll be able to use it, then you should be able to use the other methods, kind of assuming that every month has 30 days. It should be very easy for you to do. So we are not going to follow what the textbook has, but we are going to actually use the actual number of days that actually exist in each month to calculate the cash discount dating and the net payment due dating terms. Okay, so just remember that there's some corrections that you have to make on the textbook because we're using this method, and I posted on Canvas all the corrections that you have to make on the textbook. So check out the Canvas, the link called Textbook Corrections, and so that you can change the corrections, to correct the textbook for all the parts of the dating terms that are not correct in the textbook, in both the descriptions as well as the practice problem answer keys and everything. All right, so let's take a look at each dating term in more detail. The first dating term we need to learn is the COD term, which is cash on delivery. When the invoice is under the COD term, the payment must be made on the spot as the delivery takes place. So as soon as you receive the merchandise, you have to pay the bill to the person who delivers the merchandise. So it could be like truck driver in this case. When this term is written on the invoice, it would say COD or COD. This term doesn't include any cash discount. So you have to pay the entire bill, the full bill, on the spot right away. So there's no cash discount because there's no delay in the payment that you can be allowed. And of course, the net payment due is right the day that you get the merchandise, on the spot. As you heard, this term is very restrictive, right? It doesn't give any cash discount, and it asks you to pay the bill right away. Also, you have to pay it in cash. So all of these combined, this term indicates that probably the vendor would require this term to the buyer if the vendor doesn't have any history with the buyer, so it's just an unknown buyer, or the buyer has a very bad history with the vendor. So like there has been cases, had been a lot of cases where the buyer couldn't pay the bill at the due date, and things like that. So that because of the poor or unproven credit ratings of the buyer, the vendor didn't want to take the risk of giving, allowing the delayed payment, and because of that, the cash on delivery term is given, so that as soon as the vendor gives the merchandise to the buyer, they want the payment to be made. So for example, say the merchandise valued at $500 at the billed costs are purchased by a retail store under COD dating terms, then what amount must be paid and when does that payment be made? Of course, the buyer has to pay, the retail buyer has to pay the entire invoice amount, $500 as is. and the amount has to be paid right away as soon as the delivery takes place. The second dating term we're going to learn is the regular or ordinary dating term. Under the regular dating term, the cash discount period is calculated from the invoice date, which is usually the date the merchandise is shipped out by the vendor. So when you calculate the last cash discount day, which is the day, the last day the cash discount can be applied still, is calculated by adding the number of discount days that are given in the term to the invoice date, the date of invoice. So for example, let's say you have an invoice of $500 and the invoice is dated November 16th. And this invoice carries the term of 4/10 and /30. We learned how to interpret this type of cash discount term in last module, because the term that we learned, we took a look at the example term we took a look at in last module under the cash discount section was the regular dating term, in fact. So this is kind of similar to that term that we learned, we used as an example in last module. So that, let's say this time the term is 4/10 and /30. This term means that you have a 4% cash discount if you pay in 10 days, okay? And otherwise, the net payment due will be in 30 days from the invoice date, okay? So this means you have 10 days for cash discount, and the invoice date is November 16th, okay? That makes the last cash discount day to be 10 days from November 16th, so 16 plus 10 will be 26. Right? So your last cash discount date will be November 26th. Okay? So if you pay the bill, the invoice on or before November 26th, then you're going to get a 4% cash discount based on this term. You're going to have to pay only $480 because the invoice was $500, but you're going to get a 4% cash discount. So 4% times that invoice, $500, which is $20. You subtract that from your invoice cost. So what you need to remit to the vendor will be $480. Then what if you pay the bill between November 27th and December 16th? Okay? Because the net payment due, okay, last cash discount day is 26th of November. However, the absolute net payment due is termed as N/30. That means 30 days from November 16th, the invoice date, will be the final net payment due date, right? So that will be December 16th. If you add 30 days from November 16th, that will be December 16th. Okay, or you can do by adding 20 days, additional 20 days from the last cash discount date, which was November 26th. In either way, you will get December 16th because November has 30 days, right? So if you pay the bill between November 27th and December 16th, then you are going to you're not going to get any cash discount because it's already after the cash discount period is expired. So you're not going to get any cash discount, but you have to pay the full invoice of $500, right? And that also means if you pay after the December 16th, so after the net payment due date, then the vendor reserves the right to charge any carrying fees for the late payment. Okay, the vendor may decide to either charge or not charge any late fee, and it's up to the vendor. Alright, so let's work on a practice problem here using the regular dating. Okay, let's say you have an invoice for $3,500 and then the invoice is dated July 7th and it carries a term of 3/10 and /30. Okay, that means you have a 3% cash discount if you pay in 10 days of the invoice date, or your net payment due date is in 30 days from the invoice date. Okay, let's say you're paying this invoice on July 16th. Then what amount would be due? Okay, how much do you have to pay? okay, if you pay on July 16th? And that's the question. For us to answer this question, we first need to figure out when is the last cash discount day, so when the cash discount expires, okay, to see if we still can get a cash discount or not if you pay on July 16th. Okay? So depending on that determination, you are going to have to decide on how much to be paid. If it has the cash discount is not expired, then you're going to have to apply the cash discount. If it is already after the cash discount expires, then you're going to have to pay the full invoice. So determine that. Also, we would like to know when would be the net due date. So if it is, if you don't pay on July 16th or before the cash discount expires, then when would be the absolute net amount due date? Okay, let's pause the video and let's work on the problem. All right, let's work on it together. First question, when is the last 3% cash discount day? It's 10 days because it says 3/10, right? So that 10 indicates the number of cash discount days. We've got 10 days for cash discount, and the invoice date was July 7th. So July 7th plus 10 days, that will be July 17th. So since the cash discount expires on July 17th, if you pay the bill on July 16th, it is before the cash discount expiration, so you will still get the cash discount. And you're going to get a 3% cash discount because it says 3/10, okay? So 3% of 3,500 invoice has to be subtracted from 3,500, the invoice amount. So that will be $3,395. Okay, so that's all the amount that you have to pay if you pay on July 16th. And the absolute net amount due date, okay, so regardless of the cash discount, you must pay the bill, pay the invoice by 30 days from the invoice date. Okay, so the invoice date was July 7th, and you add 30 days from that, that would be August 6th. Okay, July has 31 days, so you've got 24 days left in July, and then 6 more days in August. You still can hold paying the invoice and would not incur any carrying fees or late fees and things like that. So you can wait until August 6th and pay the bill on August 6th. If that's the case, you may not get the cash discount because the cash discount already expired 20 days before August 6th, but you don't have to pay any late fee. All right, next dating term is called extra dating. Okay. The extra dating term basically means that you have extra number of days specified to the terms so that they are added to the regular dating term that you already have to extend the discount period. So basically the vendors adding extra cash discount days so that the buyer will still get the cash discount even if they pay later. This dating term is used for the vendor to encourage the buyer to buy the merchandise earlier. For example, the vendor happened to have produced a lot of merchandise items unexpectedly, or they had some returns from another buyer or something like that, so they have an urgent need to get rid of this merchandise. On the other hand, the buyer doesn't have an urgent need to purchase the merchandise right away, or doesn't want to spend the money right away, right now, at this moment. In that case, vendor may give this merchandise to the buyer and say give the extra dating term so that the buyer has a more extended period, cash discount period for them to wait and pay and still get the cash discount. And by doing so, the vendor is encouraging the buyer to make the purchase earlier than they actually need the merchandise. So under the extra dating term, the last cash discount day is calculated by adding the extra days that are written on the term as well as the regular cash discount days that are written on the term. So when you write the extra dating term on the invoice, you write it as like an example that is shown on the slide. like 3/10, which is like regular dating term, right? So that means you have 3% discount if you pay in 10 days, right? But after that, you would put 60x, okay, which indicates you've got 60 days extra, okay? Or you may write 3/10 and 60 and you actually spell out extra, E-X-T-R-A. Either way, you either write it as just X or write it out as extra. Either way, that means on top of the regular 10 days for cash discount, you're going to have 60 more days for cash discount, okay? So that automatically also extend the net amount due date. So usually it would be n/30, but because of the 60x, the n becomes now 90, right? So you the vendor may actually write the term as 3/10, 60x, n/90 or net 90. That means you will get a 3% cash discount if you pay in 10 days and 60 more days, so that entire thing would be 70 days. And your absolute net payment due is 90 days from the invoice date. So now remember that the number of cash discount days is now calculated by adding both the regular cash discount number of cash discount days, which in this case was 10, plus the number of extra days, which was 60 in this example, all together. So overall, there is going to be a 70 days for cash discount. Okay, so if the buyer pays within 70 days from the invoice date, the buyer is going to get the cash discount. All right, so let's take a look at an example here. Okay, let's say the term is 2/10, 60x, okay, and the invoice was dated July 1st. This invoice term doesn't specify N, right, the net payment due in N/what or net net what, the number of days. However, when nothing is mentioned, you can assume that there's going to be 30-day regularly 30-day net payment due, right? So that there's 30 days for kind of grace period. Because of the 60x here, the extra dating, now that is extended by 60 more days, so that means 90, right? So in this case, although the net payment due is not specified on the term, we can assume that there's going to be 90 days of net payment, okay? So, because of the regular, the kind of 30 days plus 60 more extra days, so that makes 90 days for net, okay? So let's kind of assume that this is going to be like a 2/10, 60x, and n/90, although n/90 was omitted in the term, okay? If that's the case, then when does the cash discount period end? And when is the absolute net payment due date? Okay, so to answer the first question, which is the last day for cash discount, from the term, we know that there are 10 days regularly plus 60 extra. So there's overall 70 days of cash discount, right? So, and then the invoice date was July 1st. So the last cash discount day will be July 1st plus 70 days, right? So in July, you have 30 more days left because July has 31 days, right? And so from July 2nd through the 31, you have 30 more days, okay? But you have overall 70 days, so you have to continue to go to the following month. So August, we know that there are 31 days. So the 30 days that were remaining in July plus 31 days in August, that's still 61 days overall. So we can still go 9 more days to sum up to 70 days for cash discount, right? So you've got 9 days in September, you still can get the cash discount, okay? That makes the last cash discount day September 9th. On the other hand, the absolute net payment due date will be 20 days, 20 more days after the September 9th, right? Because you had 70 cash discount days, but you've got 90 days for net payment due. So 20 days more after the September 9th, which makes the net amount due date to be September 29th. Okay, that will be the 90 days after the invoice date of July 1st. All right, so then let's work on another practice problem, okay? So let's say we have an invoice dated March 16th, and that invoice was $1,800, okay, of the billed cost. And this invoice carries the term of 3/10 60X. Again, remember, when N is not mentioned, you can assume that the net is going to be in 30 days plus whatever extra number of days that you got in the term, right? So in this case, 90 days would be the net amount due, right? Okay, so that's the case. Then what is the last day, final day for the cash discount? Okay, and how much cash discount, how many dollars of cash discount can you earn if the invoice is paid on June 25th? Okay, and what is the net amount due if you pay the bill on April 17th? Okay, so let's think about all these things and pause the video and work on the problem. All right, so let's take a look at the answer together. The first question, which was asking when is the final date for taking cash discounts. We know that we have a total of 70 days for cash discount because we had the regular 10 days plus 60 extra days, right? So March 16 plus 70 days, okay? If you do the calculation, that will be May 25th. Because in March has 31 days, right? So from March 16, there's still 15 more days left in March, so 15 days. And then entire April has the 30 days, right? So the number of days left in March plus all the days in April together is still 45 days, and you've got 70 days for for the cash discount. So 70 minus 45 will be 25 days. So you still have 25 more days in May you can get cash discount on, right? So the last cash discount day will be May 25th. Since the last cash discount day is May 25th, if you pay the bill on June 25th, that's 1 month after the last cash discount day. So you're not going to be able to get any cash discount, right? So the dollar amount for cash discount if you pay on June 25th will be 0. And if you pay the bill on April 17th is before the last cash discount day, which is May 25th, right? So you can get the cash discount if you pay the bill on April 17th. And the cash discount amount was 3% according to the term because it says 3/10 60X, right? So the first number 3 indicates the percent cash discount. So you take out 3% from the invoice of $1,800. So what you're going to end up paying as the net payment will be $1,746. Okay, so the next dating term that we're going to learn is end of month dating or EOM dating. As the name indicates, under this EOM dating, the cash discount is computed, the cash discount period is calculated from the end of month of the invoice date. Okay. One thing that we need to be very careful in applying this EOM term is that under the EOM dating, the invoices dated on or after the 25th of the month are considered to be part of the following month's transactions. Okay. What that means is that, for example, if the invoice date was July 25th, okay, the EOM, the end of month, is not 31st of July, but it's going to be the following month, so the 31st of August will be considered as the EOM, the end of month, and from which you're going to actually calculate how many more days you can get the cash discount. Well, it will be a little bit easier to understand once we take a look at examples. So let's take a look at examples on next slide. Okay, so let's take a look at these two examples that are on this slide. Okay, for both cases, the dating term is the same, 2/10 EOM. That means you're going to get 2% cash discount if you pay in 10 days from EOM, from the EOM, the end of month, right? What's different between these two examples is that the first example's invoice date is July 10th, which is before the 25th day of July. Whereas the second example, the invoice date is July 26th, which is after the 25th day of the month, July, right? So although the term is written the same, 2/10 EOM, because of the differences in the invoice date, the when is considered as EOM differs. For the first one, the EOM is going to be that month. So July 31st, okay, the end of July, okay, is going to be the EOM end of month. Okay, so the term says 2/10. That means you have 10 more days after from July 31st. Okay, so that will be August 10th. Is going to be the last day the cash discount can be applied. Okay, and the net payment due will be 20 more days after the last cash discount day, because in this case, nothing is mentioned about the net, right? N/not, 30 or net 30, nothing like that is mentioned. When I said before that when nothing is mentioned about net, you have to assume net 30, right? So we're going to do the same thing here, net 30, and in this case it's EOM dating term, so that means net the 30 days from the EOM, okay? And because the invoice date is July 10th, which is before 25th day, the EOM is July 31st, okay, 31st of July, the month of July. So that means the net amount due will be 30 days from July 31st, which makes it August 30th. Okay, so that way we can calculate the last cash discount date as August 10th and the net amount due date to be August 30th. On the other hand, in the second example below, the invoice date is July 26th, so it is after the 25th day of the month. So this transaction, this invoice has to be considered as not July invoice, but August invoice, okay? So the EOM, the end of month, is not July 31st, but going to be August 31st, end of the following month. Okay, so the cash discount period is going to end on September 10th, which is 10 days from August 31st. Okay, that also automatically pushes the net amount due date as well. So the net amount due is going to be September 30th, which is 20 days after the last cash discount day, or 30 days from the EOM, which is August 31st in this case. So because of the difference in the invoice, although both invoices were dated of July, because of the specific date difference, the EOM is applied different way. Okay, if the invoice date is before 25th day of the month, then the EOM is the end of that month, the invoice month. Whereas if the invoice date is on or after 25th day of the month, then the EOM is considered to be the end of the following month, not the invoice month. Just remember that. Remembering how we determine the EOM, okay, let's work on this practice problem. Let's say there's an invoice for $1,000 dated March 17th, okay, which is before the 25th day of March. And the invoice has the term of 8/10 EOM, so the EOM dating is going to be applied. Okay, when is going to be the last day for cash discount, and what amount do you have to pay if the bill is paid on that last cash discount day, and when is going to be the absolute net payment due, net amount due date. All right, so let's take a look at the answer together. Okay, the last day for cash discount will be 10 days from the EOM, okay, and the invoice was March 17th, which is before 25th of March. So the EOM is going to be March 31st, the end of March, right? So 10 days from March 31st will be April 10th. Okay, so April 10th is the last day for cash discount. And if you do pay the bill on April 10th, and you're going to get an 8% cash discount, so 8% of the $1,000 bill will be taken off. So what you need to pay is $920. The absolute net payment due date is going to be April 30th. So if you pay between April 11th and April 30th, you're going to have to pay the full invoice of $1,000 because it's after the cash discount period. So you're not going to get the 8% cash discount, but you don't have to pay any late fees. You just have to pay the full invoice of $1,000 if you pay between April 11th and April 30th. Okay, the April 30th, the net amount due date is determined. Although the term doesn't specify what is the net amount due, when nothing is specified, I said before that we can imply it basically implies that 30 days are going to be used for the net due, right? So it's going to be 30 days from the EOM, so 30 days from March 31st, which makes it April 30th, okay, as the net amount due date. Now let's take a look at another problem. We're using the same term and the same invoice amount, $1,000, 8/10 EOM, but the change occurs here with the invoice date, right? So now the invoice date is March 27th, okay, which is the after 25th day of March. Okay, if that's the case, then how will the answers change? Let's pause the video and work on all three questions. Okay, let's take a look at the answer together. So the invoice amount and the term are the same, but the invoice date is different, right? So now that the invoice date is March 27th, which is after the 25th day of March, the EOM, end of month, is considered to be the end of next month, which is April, right? So the April 30th will be the EOM, from which you have 10 days for cash discount. So your final date for cash discounts would be May 10th. And if you pay the bill on May 10th, you're going to get the cash discount. So the 8% cash discount is taken off of the $1,000 invoice. So what you're going to pay is $920. Since the last cash discount day is May 10th, you still have 20 more days after that for your absolute net amount due date. So your due date is going to be May 30th, which means if you pay between May 11th and May 30th, you're not going to get the cash discount, but you don't have to pay any late fee, and you've got the grace period to pay that bill, the full bill. All right, so far we've taken a look at the COD term, regular term, and the extra dating term and the EOM dating term, right? The fifth dating term we're going to learn is the receipt of goods dating, which is called ROG in an abbreviation. The ROG dating term is very different from the other dating terms in that the other dating terms use the invoice date to calculate the cash discount, right? Whereas the ROG dating term now doesn't care about the invoice date, but the discount period begins on the date the merchandise actually received, the goods are received. So all the rest are the same. So if it is like 3/10 ROG, that means you're going to have a 3% discount for 10 days after the ROG, receipt of goods, not from the invoice date. Okay? You would use this receipt of goods dating, ROG dating, when you, as a buyer, are not sure when you're going to be able to receive the merchandise. Like you place the order and from maybe a far overseas vendor, like a place in China or place like that. There's a possibility that the merchandise is shipped and it can take like a whole month for it to actually arrive in the state. In that kind of case, you don't want to just have like a regular dating term or any other dating term that can put you on a risk of having to pay the bill before you actually receive the merchandise, right? So you want to make sure as a buyer um, to receive the merchandise first before you actually pay the bill. Okay, so for that matter, when there is a possibility that it's going to take a while for the merchandise to be shipped and delivered from the point of the shipment date, which is usually the invoice date, then you request the vendor to use the ROG, the receipt of goods date, instead of the invoice date as the start point of the cash discount calculation. All right, so let's take a look at an example of ROG dating. Okay, let's say an invoice that has the term of 2/10 ROG was received. Okay, the invoice was dated July 10th. The merchandise was received on August 1st. Okay, when does the discount period begins? It's not the invoice date, but the ROG, right? So August 1st will be the date the discount period begins. Then when does the discount period ends? It's 10 days from August 1st, so August 1st plus 10 days, so that will be August 11th when the discount period ends. And finally, the absolute net amount due date will be August 31st. Okay? When the term is 2/10 and ROG, and nothing is mentioned about N net due, N/30 or anything like that, as was the case in the previous dating terms, we have to assume that the net will be 30 days. Okay, so in this case, because it is ROG, it will be 30 days from ROG, receipt of goods, right? So the receipt of goods was on August 1st, and from which you're going to have 30 days for the absolute net amount due. So your net amount due date is August 31st. All right, so let's work on a ROG dating practice problem. Okay, so let's say you're a buyer and you've got an invoice for $100, which is dated April 4th. And the invoice carries the term of 5/10 ROG. Okay, and the merchandise arrived in the store on May 7th. Okay, in this case, when will be the last date the cash discount can be still deducted? And if the payment was made on the last day of cash discount, then what would be the payment, the amount? And when is the absolute net amount due date? Okay, let's pause the video and work on the problem. All right, so the first question is about the last cash discount date. Since this is based on a ROG dating, we don't care about the invoice date at all. So completely ignore the invoice date April 4th and just pay attention to the ROG, right? The receipt of merchandise, receipt of goods date, which is May 7th. Okay, and the term says 5/10. That means you've got 10 days from ROG. So May 7th plus 10 days, that will be May 17th. That is your last cash discount date. And if you pay the bill on May 17th, the last cash discount date, you've got the 5% cash discount. So 5% of $100 will have to be taken off. So you have to pay only $95. The absolute net payment due is 30 days from ROG, right? Again, the term doesn't say what is the net term, right? It's just said 5/10 ROG. It doesn't say N/30 or anything like that. When nothing is mentioned, it implies a 30 date net. due. So given that assumption, we can think that the net payment due, net amount due is going to be 30 days from Roth, May 7th. Okay, so May has 31 days, so May still have 24 days left. So you have 6 more days in June that you can still wait and pay. So that will be June 6th, right? This means if you pay the invoice between May 18th and June 6th, then you're going to have to pay $100, the invoice, full invoice with no cash discount. However, you don't have to pay any carrying fees. All right, so let's take an overview of all the 5 dating terms we've learned so far. So let's say you have an invoice of $1,000 that comes with the dating term of COD, called cash on delivery. That means you have to pay the full bill of $1,000 in cash right away to the truck driver when he delivers the merchandise to you. It's a cash payment on delivery. Then we learned a regular dating term or ordinary dating term. For example, let's say the same $1,000 invoice, but it came with a term of 3/10 and /30. Okay, that means you can get a 3% cash discount, so you only pay $970 if you pay the bill within 10 days after the invoice date. Otherwise, the net amount due, $1,000, will be due in 30 days from the invoice date. Then we learned the extra dating term, right? For example, $1,000 invoice comes with a term of 3/10 60x. That means you have extra cash discounts, right? And your net due is also pushed by that as many as the extra dates. In this case, you've got 10 days for regular plus 60 extra dates. So overall, you've got 70 days, right, for cash discount. So you're going to get a 3% cash discount, so pay only $970 if you pay this invoice within 70 days after the invoice date. Otherwise, the net due of $1,000 will be in 90 days from the invoice date. All right, so the 4th type of dating we learned was the EOM dating. Okay, for example, the same $1,000 invoice, if it came with a term of 3/10 EOM, okay, and then let's say the invoice date was May 24th, okay, so May 24th is before the 25th day of May, right? So the EOM end of month is May 31st, the end of May, right? So from May 31st, you've got 10 days because it's 3/10. Right? 10 days for cash discount. So you are going to get a 3% cash discount if you pay this bill on or before June 10th, 10 days from May 31st, EOM, right? Otherwise, your net amount of $1,000 will be due on June 30th. Okay? When nothing is mentioned about the end, we assume that you're going to have 30 days for net due, right? So in this case, 30 days from EOM, so from May 31st, so that makes the net due date as June 30th. What if the same EOM term was carried, however, the invoice date was May 25th? So, the previous example, it was May 24th. Now the invoice date is May 25th. Just 1 day difference, right? But according to the EOM dating term, when the invoice is dated on or after the 25th day of the month, that transaction is considered as the following month transaction. So the EOM, the end of month, is the EOM of the following month, right? So the EOM is actually June 30th, and you've got 10 days from June 30th for cash discounts. So now, in this case, you're going to get a 3% cash discount if you pay this invoice on or before July 10th instead of June 10th. Okay. Otherwise, your net amount of $1,000, the full invoice is due by July 30th. Again, the same 30 days from the EOM was assumed when nothing was mentioned about the M and the net due, right, in the term. Finally, we learned the ROG dating term, receipt of goods dating term. Let's say the same $1,000 invoice was now carrying a term of 3/10 ROG. And the invoice date was April 15th, but the merchandise was received on May 31st. Okay, in this case, because the term is ROG, you don't care about the invoice date. We only take a look at the date the merchandise was received, May 31st. Right? So you are going to get a 3% cash discount if you pay the bill on or before June 10th, which is in 10 days from May 31st, the receipt of goods. Right? Otherwise, the net amount of $1,000 will be due on June 30th, which is 30 days from the ROG, May 31st. Again, in this case, nothing was said in the term. There's nothing like N/30. However, when nothing is mentioned about the net due specifically, then we assume it is N/30. Okay, so that means 30 days from ROG in this case. The last dating term that we're going to learn is what we call post or advanced dating. This dating term basically means that the vendor puts a future date on the invoice instead of the date that the merchandise shipped out. I said before, the invoice date is usually the day the merchandise is shipped out from the vendor. Okay. However, if the vendor decides to put a future date on the invoice, so that the cash discount clock starts later at a future date and to give additional time to the buyer, for the buyer to pay the bill and still get the cash discount, just to extend the time, the number of days that the buyer can get the cash discount. So for example, let's say the term is written as 2/10 N/30. It looks just like a regular dating term, right? You have a 2% cash discount if you pay in 10 days. Otherwise, the net due is in 30 days. Say the merchandise is shipped out on February 10th. So that means usually the invoice should be dated February 10th, right? But in this case, the vendor decided to put May 1st as the invoice date. Okay, so although the merchandise was shipped out on February 10th, the invoice says the invoice date is May 1st. So the buyer can get the cash discount if they pay the bill by May 11th, which is 10 days from the invoice date. Okay, and the buyer's net amount due will be May 31st, which is 30 days from May 1st, which is the invoice date. So that invoice date is definitely a future date, a later date than the date at the merchandise was actually shipped out. So far we've learned all the dating terms. Okay. Now we're moving on to the anticipation. In last module, I started discussing the anticipation as part of the discounts, right? It's an additional cash discount. So I explained this, the definition and meanings of the anticipation. Okay, just to revisit what I said in last module, anticipation is the extra cash discount that is added in on top of the cash discount based on the dating term. Okay? And the anticipation is granted, okay, only when the vendor wants to grant it, okay? And when it is granted by the vendor decides on the amount of anticipation based on how many days earlier the buyer paid the invoice before the cash discount date. Anticipation is prepared by the vendor to benefit the buyer, to kind of encourage the buyer to pay early, and also the vendor can benefit by receiving the payment early. Okay, so the vendor has the need to get the payment early, although the vendor might have given a long cash discount period and long net amount due. If there was any circumstances where the vendor has to have the money earlier, then they may add additional rebate on top of the cash discount to lure the buyer to pay early. And that's the concept of anticipation. So the amount of anticipation is basically the amount of rebate that is corresponding to the amount of interest that the buyer might have gotten on the payment if they had left that money in the bank instead of paying the bill. Okay? So as much as that will be rebated back to the buyer, and that is determining the anticipation amount. The anticipation is taken in addition to all the other discounts, so trade discounts and quantity discount. After those things were taken off, what's left is the billed cost, right? And cash discount is also calculated as percent of billed cost. The same way, anticipation is an additional cash discount, so it is also calculated based on percent of the billed cost. In case you have zero quantity discount, then your invoice cost equals your billed cost. The invoice cost that is established after the trade discounts have been taken off, that invoice cost will be your billed cost when there's no quantity discount, right? So that's why I put it on this slide, said anticipation is calculated based on a percent of the invoice cost or billed cost. So the amount of cost that you are calculating the anticipation on, that percent on, is the same invoice or billed cost that you use to calculate cash discount. So generally, the anticipation is combined with the cash discount in the calculation of the net cost that you have to pay. The first step to figure out how much anticipation can be taken off is to figure out the number of days anticipation. The number of days anticipation is calculated based on the number of days that is remaining between the last cash discount day and the actual payment date. Okay, so basically if you pay today, then how many more days are still left before the cash discount expires? So the dollar anticipation is calculated by multiplying your invoice or billed cost after the trade discount or quantity discount have been taken off. That invoice cost times, okay, the annual interest rate, okay, that you might get from a bank. This interest rate is agreed upon between the vendor and buyer, that to determine, okay, for this anticipation, we're granting this anticipation based on this annual interest rate, things like that. So it is determined in advance. And then you see the number of days anticipation calculated in the manner that I explained in the previous slide. And you divide the number of days anticipation by 360 days. According to the financial calendar, a year has 360 days. Okay? Every month is a 30-day month, right? So according to the bank, the financial calendar the bank uses, the interest rate is calculated in that manner. So how many days anticipation are remaining, and divide that by 360 days and time that by an annual interest rate, and that percent, okay, the fraction of the annual interest rate corresponding to the number of days anticipation, that will be multiplied by the invoice cost, and that way you know how much anticipation can be taken off. Then once you know your anticipation dollar, then you can calculate how much is your actual net payment, net amount due. Okay, so the actual amount that you will have to pay, and net amount will be the invoice cost or the billed cost after trade discounts and quantity discounts are taken off, minus cash discount dollar, because your anticipation is applicable only when you pay before the cash discount period ends, right? So obviously you paid before your cash discount expires, so you are going to get the cash discount, so that much has to be taken off. And on top of the cash discount, you're going to also get the anticipation back, right? So your net payment due is going to be invoice cost minus cash discount minus anticipation. So anticipation is an additional cash discount on top of the cash discount. All right, so let's try to understand the formulas and how to actually apply this anticipation by using this example. Okay, let's say you have an invoice for $100. Okay, and the invoice is dated December 4th, and the invoice carries the term of 2/10 30x and /60, so it's extra dating. Anticipation is permitted, and if the invoice is paid on December 14th, okay, and the annual interest rate on which the anticipation is calculated is 6%. Okay, so anticipation is calculated based on an annual interest rate of 6%. In this case, what is going to be the dollar anticipation? And so as a result, how much should be paid to the vendor? Okay, remember here in working on this problem, how many days cash discount you have for you to be able to calculate the number of days anticipation, which is the key, the first thing that you need to figure out. Because you're using extra dating, you've got 2/10, which means you have got 10 regular cash discount days plus 30 extra days, right? So overall, you have a 40 days for cash discounts, right? And you pay the bill on December 14th, which is 10 days after the invoice date. The invoice was December 4th, right? So you have the overall total of 40 days for cash discount, but you paid in 10 days from the invoice date. So you've used up 10 days out of the 40 days of cash discount before you pay the bill, right? So what's remaining will be 40 minus 10, so you still have 30 days left, right? That 30 is the number of days anticipation, the number of days that are remaining between the actual payment day, December 14th, and the last cash discount day, which would have been 30 days after December 14th, right? So remember that to calculate the dollar anticipation. Okay. All right, let's pause the video here and see and work on the problem based on the formulas that we shared on the previous slide. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the answer together. Okay, so number of days anticipation, as I said before, will be 30 days because there is 10 day plus 30 extra days for anticipation for the cash discount, I'm sorry. So there's 40 days for cash discount, but you pay the bill in 10 days from the invoice date, so you still have 30 more days that you could have just waited and put the money in the bank instead of paying to the vendor, right? So that is the number of days anticipation. So the dollar anticipation will be calculated by knowing the invoice cost, $100, times the annual interest rate on which the anticipation is based, so it's 6%, times the number of days anticipation, 30 days, divided by 360 days. Okay, if you do this calculation, it comes out to be just 50 cents. Okay, then how much should be paid to the vendor? Okay. From the invoice, you will have to not only take off the anticipation, but also have to take off the cash discount because you paid before the cash discount period ends, right? So cash discount is 2%. It says 2/10, so it's 2%. 2% of $100 will be taken off as cash discount, so that's like $2. And also the anticipation was calculated to be 50 cents. So you subtract $2.50. So that leaves $97.5 as the net amount due. So now let's revisit the diagram that I showed in last module in terms of the order of discounts. right? Now that we've learned all the discounts as well as the dating terms and how to calculate anticipation, now we can understand this order of discounts much better, right? The trade discount is taken off from the list price or suggested retail price, right? And once you take off the trade discount from list price, what's left is what we call invoice cost. Trade discount is used to establish the item invoice cost. Then from the invoice cost, if you meet certain minimum amount on order quantity criterion that is set by the vendor, you may get a quantity discount. Okay, and subtract quantity discount off of the invoice cost, what's left is what we call billed cost. And then, as we saw in the example on the previous slide, the cash discount dollar and anticipation dollars are subtracted from the billed cost to establish the actual net cost that you end up paying to the vendor, right? And of course, if the quantity discount is zero, which means there's no quantity discount, in that case your invoice cost will be equal to your billed cost. So the cash discount and anticipation can be calculated based on the invoice cost. Okay, if there is any quantity discounts that is not zero, then you have to take off the quantity discount first for you to be able to know what billed cost is to be able to calculate the cash discount and anticipation based on the billed cost. So now that we know all 3 or 4 kinds of discounts, trade discount, quantity discount, cash discount, and anticipation, and what order they have to be discounted, and on what basis this trade discount, quantity discount, and cash discount anticipation must be calculated, we can now think about an example problem where we have to do all the discounts starting from the list price to establish the net amount that you have to pay, right? So let's take a look at an example problem here. Let's say a gift store purchased 50 stuffed animals that were suggested to be retailed at $50 each by the manufacturer. So the manufacturer or the vendor said, okay, this stuffed animal, little doll, can be sold for $50 in your store. And the gift store buyer purchased 50 of these stuffed animals. And the vendor, the manufacturer, established a trade discount of 30% for this gift store buyer. Okay. And when the merchandise was received, the invoice indicated that an additional 5% quantity discount was allowed when more than 40 units were purchased. And obviously, the buyer purchased 50 units, so this 5% quantity discount will be also applied. Okay. And the invoice carried a term of 3/10 and/30, a regular dating term. And this manufacturer also promised to grant a 6% anticipation. This means it's not saying that it's giving you a 6% discount, but it's the anticipation will be calculated based on an annual interest rate of 6%. Okay, just remember that. So use the annual interest rate of 6% to calculate the anticipation dollar. Okay, so now in this problem, the trade discount, quantity discount, and cash discount and anticipation terms are all given. Okay, so based on this, all these terms, what amount should be remitted to the manufacturer, so paid to the manufacturer, if the payment was made in 8 days from the invoice date. Okay, trade discount and quantity discount have nothing to do with when the invoice is paid, right? So remember that. But the cash discount and anticipation have to do with when the invoice is paid. So remember that. So utilize the information that the payment was made in 8 days from the invoice date when you calculate the cash discount and anticipation. But for the trade discount and quantity discount, that information won't be relevant, right? So go ahead and do the calculation starting from trade discount. So starting from list price, getting trade discount off to establish the invoice cost, and then take off quantity discount and establish billed cost, and then take off cash discount and anticipation from the billed cost to finally know how much you need to pay. Okay, so let's pause the video here. Let's work on the problem. All right, so let's take a look at the answer step by step. Okay, So the first order in the discounts is trade discount. So we're going to have to start from the list price and trade discount, right? The list price, or suggested retail price that was given in the problem, is that every unit is $50 and the buyer purchased 50 units, right? So $50 times 50 units, overall the list price, total list price was $2,500. And then the trade discount was given as 30% trade discount was given to the buyer, right? So the invoice cost established after the trade discount is taken off will be the list price 2,500 times 100% minus 30%, so times 70% or 0.7. So that will be $1,750 invoice cost. Next, the quantity discount is calculated based on the invoice cost after trade discount is taken off, right? Because the buyer purchased 50 units and the minimum requirement for the quantity discount is 40 units, the buyer is going to get the quantity discount, which was 5%, right? So 5% of the invoice cost will be the quantity discount, right? So the build cost after the quantity discount is $1,750 times 100% minus 5%, which is 95%. And so the build cost is $1,662.5 this way. Now that we have trade discount and quantity discounts are taken off, now we're going to have to move to the cash discount and anticipation. First, the cash discount is 3%, right? 3/10 was the term, right? So 3% if you pay within 10 days from the invoice date. And the question said that the bill was paid in 8 days after the invoice date. So definitely the buyer is going to get the cash discount. The cash discount was 3%, so 3% times the build cost, right? Build cost after the quantity discount, right? So quantity discount was the one step before the cash discount in the order of discounts, right? So we're going to use the build cost after quantity discount, which was $1,662.5 as the basis for the cash discount calculation. So 3% times that build cost is $49.88. Now, to be able to calculate the anticipation dollar, you need to first know the number of days anticipation, right? The dating term said that you had 10 days for the cash discount, but you paid the bill in 8 days. So the number of days anticipation, which is the number of days that you could have waited and still would have gotten cash discount, is 2 days, right? The difference between the actual payment date and the last cash discount date would be 2 days, okay? Therefore, the net payment that is due to be paid to the vendor will be the build cost minus cash discount minus anticipation. The build cost after quantity discount, $1,662.5, minus the cash discount we just calculated, $49.88, minus the anticipation dollar, which we will have to calculate again based on the build cost, so $162.5 times the problem said that the annual interest rate of 6% will be used for the calculation of anticipation. So we use the interest rate of 6% times number of days anticipation was 2 days. Therefore, 2 divided by 360. So that parenthesized portion that is shown on this screen comes up to 55 cents. Okay, so that 55 cents will be your anticipation. So your net payment will be the build cost minus cash discount minus that 55 cents of anticipation, which leaves the buyer with $1,612.07 as the net payment to be paid to the vendor. All right, so this concludes module number 26. So we've in last module and this module we've talked about discounts and dating terms. In next module we are going to talk about the final D in the sales term, which is about deliveries. All right, so don't forget to work on module problem assignment 26. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.